Continue, Lilith.
Hi, everybody. Now, Judith Celie is a professor in the Department of Archeology at the University of Cape Town, where she holds the South African Research Chair in Stable Isotope Archaeology and Paleo-Environmental Studies. Her research includes the archaeology of the South African hunter-gatherers, and of course the later herders and farming communities. And her approach is analytical, particularly isotope, to archaeology. She has published more than 120 research papers, topics ranging from wildlife ecology, and I have asked her to expand on the wildlife side because we haven't had a wildlife talk in some time. And she has even dealt with the diets of the slaves in the Cape. And she has approximately supervised 30 master's and PhD students. I haven't seen Judith since conference days, pre the white hair, and I hope you're all intrigued by the title, particularly the word turn. It's to do with the winds that the sailing ships relied on, and when they had to turn to avoid hitting the Cape of Storms. But I'm hoping Judith will explain it far more professionally than I. So over to you, Judith.
Thank you, Lilith, and thank you to you all for inviting me to give this talk. It's great to be able to talk about what we do to a broader audience. I'm going to start my screen share.
And it's working.
Yeah, it's working, great. Great. So, as Lilith said, I've entitled this talk, Lost on the Turn of the Cape of Good Hope, which is a direct quotation from a 16th century manuscript. And what I'm going to talk about is a 16th century ivory cargo and its relevance in the 21st century. So this is a story that began in 2008.
Thank you.
I'm trying to, yeah, there we go. This is a story that began in 2008 in southern Namibia, and the image you're seeing on the screen here shows the town of Oranjemund, just north of the mouth of the Orange River. You can see the braided mouth of the Orange River there. And as you know, this is the area that is controlled by NAMDEB, the Namibian Diamond Mining De Beers organization. And they are mining the diamonds that washed down the Orange River, the alluvial diamonds that came down the river and then dispersed along the shoreline. So as many of you will know, the way that NAMDEB does that is they build these coffer dams, these rectangular structures along the coastline to keep the seawater back. And then they pump out any water that's at the bottom of the dam, and then they vacuum up the sand and the gravel, and they hope the diamonds that are lying there amongst the other sediments. And in 2008, they were opening up some new coffer dams, and they were busy with their vacuuming up. And their vacuum kept getting blocked. And the first few times it got blocked, they thought, well, you know, that's a nuisance. And then it got blocked by something that was recognizably a cannon. And at that point, they said, aha, we've got something here that's not just irritating, it's potentially of historical interest. And they called in an archaeologist with whom they'd already had some dealings in the past, who looked at this and immediately said, this is potentially very interesting, and put together a team to start removing the sand in a more controlled manner to see what was there. And here's a picture of the work in progress. And you can see that they're uncovering there a lot of bits of wood. Those are ship's timbers. And all around and amongst those ship's timbers were large quantities of the ship's cargo. They recovered about 40 tons of cargo.
Okay.
A lot of it was artifacts of various kinds. And here is one of the archaeologists holding some astrolabes. So these are navigational instruments. And this particular kind of astrolabe was in use from the 16th to the middle of the 17th century. So that's immediately a clue to the likely date of this shipwreck. They also found large quantities of copper ingots. And these hemispherical copper ingots come from, they were cast in Poland and in Austria. We know that because many of them have the maker's mark stamped on them. And so this was a way of distributing copper as a raw material. These ingots were destined to be melted down and refashioned into items of various kinds. There was much excitement when they started to find elephant tusks. So they recovered more than 100 raw elephant tusks, unworked elephant tusks. And probably there were lots more on the ship because only a small part of the ship was preserved and was able to be salvaged. And also, they found quite considerable quantities of gold and silver coins. So this really was a treasure ship. It was carrying mainly Spanish and Portuguese coins of different types. But some of them, like the image on the right there, that coin on the right is a Portuguese 10 Cruzado gold coin. And that particular style of coin was minted first in the year 1525. And because it was gold and because it was a sizable coin, unfortunately, the amount of gold that went into making these coins was actually worth more than the face value of the coin as currency. So once people realized this, they didn't want to spend those coins. They hoarded them. They just kept them for the raw material value. And once the authorities twigged that this was what was going on, they withdrew those coins from circulation. So those coins were only in circulation between 1525 and the late 1530s. And because there were quite a number of them in this pile of coins, it seems likely that the ship dates from that period between 1525 and the late 1530s. So this would have been one of the carracks, or the naus, as the Portuguese called them, one of the big long distance trading ships. And this image, this picture, shows the East India fleet of 1507. So these are the ships that set out from Portugal in 1507 to sail to the east, and they were laden with exactly the kind of cargo we've just been looking at. And they were going to the east to trade for spices and silks and other precious commodities that they were going to bring back to Portugal. These were custom-built ships. They were very large-bodied ships so that they could fit a lot of cargo in. And they were heavily armed because they needed to be able to protect that cargo against pirates. They also carried as much sail as they could, as much sail as the shipmakers thought was safe to carry, because they wanted to make this journey as quickly as possible. They wanted to get to India and back within the shortest time. Ideally, about the best they could do was 6 months each way. So these voyages, if all went well, were estimated to take about 6 months from Portugal to India, and then about 6 months from India back to Portugal on the return leg. At this time, the Portuguese had already worked out that the best way to make the journey from Portugal to India was not to sail down the coast of Africa, because that's quite treacherous. You're in a lot of shallow water. The wind is unpredictable. It's difficult to navigate big ships like this close inshore. So these East India fleets were sailing westwards across the South Atlantic, almost to the coast of Brazil. Then they were turning and sailing back towards the southern tip of Africa. And then they were turning again and sailing up the East African coast and then across the Indian Ocean to India. So these are long distance, deep water ships. Each of these ships would have carried about 300 men. That would have included sailors, of course. It would also have included soldiers. It would have included specialist traders to do the business side of things. And there would have been people like priests and doctors and other specialists on board. This picture that we're looking at here shows the fleet of 1507. But the likely identification of the ship that was found at Oranienburg is from a slightly later fleet. And that's an image of what we think the Oranienburg ship is. This was from the fleet of 1533. And this was a ship called the Good Jesus, the Bom Jesus. You can see the name of the ship written at the top of the slide there. And that was captained by a man called Dom Francisco de Noronha. And this ship was lost, perdido, on the turn of the Cape of Good Hope. That's what is recorded in the records. The ship disappeared somewhere near where the ships turned around the Cape of Good Hope. In fact, it didn't quite make it to the Cape of Good Hope. It wrecked in southern Namibia. We don't know why it wrecked. Perhaps there was a navigational problem. This coastline, of course, is famous for its very heavy fog. And this ship got too close inshore and it went aground, and there was no attempt at a rescue. That wasn't possible. But the rest of the fleet noticed that this ship had gone missing somewhere near the Cape of Good Hope. And that was the last that was known of it until bits of it turned up in the Namibian diamond mining operations in 2008. So as archaeologists, we would like to try to find out more about the cargo. What can we say about the cargo? We'd like to know where the various items came from. We'd like to know what this cargo can tell us about global trade and global interconnections in the early 16th century. This is an interesting period because it's less than 50 years after Vasco da Gama first rounded the Cape of Good Hope. This is very early in the long distance trade between Europe and the East. So our team worked specifically on the ivory in the cargo. There has been a study of those copper ingots that I showed you a picture of, and they've been able to identify which foundries they were cast at and something about the origins of the metal. But what I'm going to talk about this evening is specifically the ivory. So we want to know where the ivory came from and what it can tell us about early global maritime trade. And this is the team that worked on the project. The group in the left-hand picture is mostly staff members from the National Museum of Namibia who've been of course, very much involved in this once it was realized what it was. The two young women on the right are the people who've done most of the analytical work that I'm going to be describing in a minute. The top picture is Ashley Coutu, who was for some years a postdoc with us in Cape Town, and she did the stable isotope work. The lower picture is Alida de Fleming, who did the DNA work as part of her PhD research. And there were many other people involved as well in the excavations, in the historical research, and so on. So this is very much a group, a team project. Here we are in the very nice storage facility that NAMDEB built to house the material that was recovered from the wreck. So this is in the diamond mining area. This is quite close to where the wreck actually was. And so it's behind the NAMDEB security cordon, which is a good thing in terms of keeping all this material safe and protected. And the woman in the picture on the right is Nzila Marina Mubanda, who is holding one of the tusks that we sampled. So the first thing that one can do with a shipment of tusks like this is to weigh and measure the tusks. That had already been done before we started, before we got involved in the project. And these tusks are all different sizes. They came from elephants ranging from very young elephants to big bulls with all sizes in between. So the people who hunted these elephants were hunting any elephant that had tusks. They were taking big tusks, small tusks, whatever they could get. Our team did stable isotope analyses to find out what the elephants were eating, what their diets consisted of, because from that, we can make inferences about what kinds of habitats they lived in. And that is of interest from a number of points of view. The DNA work had two aspects. The first was the analysis of nuclear DNA, which can tell us what species of elephant the tusks came from, whether it was the savanna species of elephant that's widespread across Africa. Our Southern African elephants are all savanna elephant species, or the forest species of elephant, which is more restricted in its distribution. So genetically, forest elephants occur in Central Africa and in West Africa in dense tropical forests. And then secondly, the DNA also studied the mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondria are these small organelles, sort of folded structures in the cells that are involved in energy metabolism in the cells. And they have their own DNA that's inherited only through the maternal line. So the mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mother to daughter and to sons, and then daughters pass it on to their offspring. So it traces the maternal inheritance, whereas the nuclear DNA is inherited from both parents. Tracing the maternal lineages is particularly interesting in elephants because elephants live in female-led groups. So the female elephants tend to stay together. The daughters stay with their mothers and their daughters stay with them. The male elephants may disperse to other groups, but the social structure of elephants is female-centered. And so the female elephants in a group have mostly the same maternal lineages, the same mitochondrial DNA. So looking at the mitochondrial DNA is a proxy for looking at the herd that that elephant came from. I hope that makes sense. We can talk about it some more later if people want clarification on that. So what did we find? Well, the analyses of the nuclear DNA showed that the elephants, all of the elephants from which it was possible to extract good quality DNA, were genetically forest elephants. They came from the species Loxodonta cyclotis, not the species Loxodonta africana, which is genetically the savanna elephant. We thought that was really interesting. We hadn't really expected that because forest elephants are somewhat smaller than savanna elephants. Their tusks tend to be somewhat smaller, but the ivory is a bit harder, so I'm told, than the ivory from savanna elephants. And that does make it apparently particularly desirable for people who are carving ivory. It's particularly good quality ivory for carving. So we've got a shipment of tusks that consist of genetically forest elephants and that come from particular mitochondrial lineages. So this map shows the geographic distribution of different mtDNA subclades, it's called here, a bit technically. Basically, these are different maternal lineages of elephants. And you can see that they are geographically clustered across Africa. And that makes sense because elephants do disperse somewhat, but we would expect that there's going to be regional differentiation on this kind of geographical scale. So in West Africa, we have these particular mitochondrial lineages that are shown here in blue, in sort of turquoise and teal blue. Those are the Western and the West Central lineages. In other parts of Africa, we see different lineages, but all of the shipwreck ivory was from those West Central and Western lineages. That means that those tusks would have come from this part of West Africa that today is the countries of the Ivory Coast, no surprises there, and Ghana, Togo, Benin, Liberia, Sierra Leone. That's the likely area of origin of that shipwreck ivory cargo. The Portuguese were also, in the early 16th century, active slightly further south along the West African coast in the areas that are now the countries of Gabon and Cameroon and down into the Congo. But in that part of Africa, we also have elephants of the North Central lineage. That's the green circles on the diagram here. And we have none of those elephants in the shipwreck ivory cargo. So we're reasonably confident that those tusks didn't come from Gabon or Cameroon or the Congo, that they came rather from further to the north and the west in the areas that are only occupied by West Central and Western lineages. Particularly interestingly, there were 17 different maternal lineages in the shipwreck tusks. Of those 17 different lineages, only 4 have been documented amongst modern West African elephants. And that means that 3/4 of the genetic diversity that we can see in the shipwreck cargo is not known from modern West African elephants. It is true that we don't have a very large number of observations of modern West African elephants yet, because it's quite difficult to get samples, but it's also almost certain that a lot of the genetic diversity we can see in the shipwreck has been lost due to the populations being hard hit by poaching and by habitat destruction. So much for the for the DNA work. Our team also looked at the isotopic composition of the elephant ivory. And here we're looking at the ratios of naturally occurring isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in the body tissues. So both carbon-13 and carbon-12, nitrogen-15 and nitrogen-14 occur naturally in the world around us, but they're differentially distributed in, for example, grasses and trees. So by measuring the ratios of carbon isotopes in animals' body tissues, we can tell whether they were eating a lot of grass or a lot of trees or bushes. And therefore, we can tell something about the habitats that those elephants were living in. And we express or we present those measurements usually on these sorts of bipolar plots, two-dimensional graphs. In this example, we're representing the ratio of the nitrogen isotopes on the vertical axis and the carbon isotopes on the horizontal axis. And so in a plot like this, points, ivory samples that lie to the left-hand side of the graph would be from elephants that come from deep forest environments, and therefore they're only eating trees. Elephants that lie to the right of the graph are eating both trees and grass and come from savanna environments. Elephants that lie towards the top of the graph come from dry habitats. Those that lie towards the bottom of the graph come from moist habitats. And we've done a lot of measurements like this on samples of modern ivory. So these are elephants that we know where they've come from, and they're represented by the green dots on this map. And those are most of the areas where elephants still occur in Africa today. So we've got a good comparative database against which to compare the ivory from the shipwreck. And if we do that, we get a graph like this. And here we've got the shipwreck tusks shown as these little black dots, and the modern specimens shown with the other symbols. And just to make it a bit easier to read, I've coded the deep forest elephants in green and the savanna elephants in brown. So the deep forest elephants, which plot to the left of this graph, are from places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, those are the squares, or Liberia, those are the circles, or Cameroon, those are the diamond shapes. Whereas the savanna elephants come largely from Southern Africa, from South Africa, from Namibia, from Botswana, but we do also have them from other countries as well. So the first thing to notice about the shipwreck tusks, the solid black dots, is that the shipwreck tusks came from elephants that did not live in deep forest habitats. Although these are genetically the forest species of elephant, they came from environments that were sort of intermediate between forest environments and savanna environments. In other words, they were probably living on the edges of the deep forests. That's interesting and somewhat surprising, because on the edges of the deep forests, they would have been in habitats that would have overlapped with genetically savanna elephants. And we know that there's habitat sharing today between genetically forest elephants and genetically savanna elephants. But wildlife biologists have thought that that was probably because of intensive hunting and habitat disruption in recent centuries. But the evidence that we're looking at here shows us that that was the case 500 years ago, even before the intensive hunting of these populations for commercial use. The other thing that's remarkable about this diagram is how scattered those black dots are compared with the rest of the points. So remember, the rest of the colored images are elephant variation across the whole of the African continent. But in the shipwreck cargo, we're looking, at least in the horizontal dimension, that at almost half as much variation as we can see across the whole of Africa. That means that those shipwreck tusks came from elephants that came from a range of different habitats, a range of different localities. That, of course, is consistent with their having come from 17 different maternal lineages. But this evidence that we're looking at shows that they were really quite widespread, the herds that this ivory was coming from. So this is telling us that there was geographically quite extensive procurement of ivory to feed this early ivory trade. These tusks would have been carried down to the coast by porters to pass on to the Portuguese. And almost certainly these tusks were transported back to Lisbon and stockpiled in the warehouses on the shores of the Tagus River for loading up onto these big intercontinental carracks that were sailing on the East India route. So this is consistent with what's documented about ivory procurement and loading onto the big long distance ships. Those carracks were not picking up this ivory as they went along the sailing down the African coast. This kind of evidence is interesting not only because we can learn about historical things, but it's also interesting because we can apply it in the growing field of what people call wildlife forensics. So for example, when conservation authorities seize hauls of what they suspect might be poached ivory, one of the first questions they want to answer is, where did this ivory come from? And we can use exactly the same techniques that I've just been describing, the stable isotope measurements, the DNA measurements, to distinguish broadly where that ivory is likely to have come from, what what mitochondrial DNA lineages, what sort of habitat the ivory derives from. And this kind of analysis is now being done routinely on confiscated ivory, and it's been possible to document in this way shifts in where the poaching hotspots are. So over the last number of years, the poaching hotspots have shifted from East Africa to Central Africa. And more recently, there seems to have been a sort of concentration of poaching in what's now the Congo. And so if one knows that, it's possible to allocate the very scarce resources that the authorities have to police and to sort of try and contain the poaching to the areas that are currently poaching hotspots, and thereby try to control the trade. So this is being done on a considerable scale for ivory, but one can do exactly the same kind of thing, and indeed it is being done for other species. And so some of the ones that I happen to know about include rhino horn. So because rhinos have rather different diets, one needs to construct a sort of baseline data set, a reference map for each species individually. But there's been similar work done on rhino horn to try to source confiscated rhino horn, on pangolins to try to deal with the trade in pangolin scales, and also some species of plants. One can do the same kind of work to try to control the stealing of cycads and the resale of cycads, and some of the rare succulents that are also now very sought after and command very high prices to specialist collectors. So this field of wildlife forensics, I think, is something that we're going to see more and more of in the years to come. Our lab is also now starting to get involved in some human forensic studies, but that's a topic perhaps for another talk on another day. So to sum up and just focus in on the conclusions of what we were able to learn from this work, we were able to find out that the shipwreck ivory comes from the forest species of elephant, but that many of those animals were living in savanna habitats, that they come from a very genetically diverse group of elephants, many of them from lineages that are not known amongst modern forest elephants, and that therefore those forest elephants were occupying and sharing savanna habitats with savanna elephants even before extensive disturbance of elephant ecology in the last few hundred years. There's obviously a lot of potential here for similar studies of other collections of ivory in archaeological shipwrecks or other contexts, in museums. We do know of a number of other shipwrecks around the world that were carrying cargoes of ivory, and we hope that it'll be possible to do similar kinds of studies on those in the future. To date, this is the largest study of this kind that has been done. And it's very interesting to think about the point that during these very early stages of globalization, these early stages of the intercontinental maritime trade, that ivory was a key commodity that was driving the formation of these trade links. Later on, in the intercontinental maritime trade, slavery, of course, became very important. And the slave trade is what perhaps we most think about when we think about trade across the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans. But that was later, that was in later centuries, and those trade routes were established and they were set up using commodities like ivory, which was a really key item at this time. And finally, that these kinds of studies also have application to 21st century problems, 21st century challenges, such as trying to manage the poaching of wildlife and the conservation of what wildlife we have left. So I'd like to finally just thank the various organizations that funded this work and the various people who collaborated on it. As I've said, it was very much a team effort, and we're very grateful to all of the people who contributed in one way or another. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions that people might like to ask.
Judy, thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions, and even starting here with me, ivory, what would its value have been as a trade commodity when it got to the Far East, to India or Indonesia?
So yes, people have sometimes asked, but surely people in the East had their own ivory. Indian elephants also can provide ivory. So why did they need ivory from Africa? I think the issue here is that that ivory was a very sought after commodity, that there was more demand than the local supply could fulfill. And so the people in India were looking for more ivory. They were willing to buy it. It's food for thought that at this time, people in Europe didn't have all that much that people in the East actually wanted to buy. They were essentially exporting raw materials for skilled craftsmen in the East to fashion into worked goods. The copper was being exported as raw material. The gold was going to be melted down and reworked. The ivory was going to be fashioned into bracelets or ornaments or stamps or one thing or another. So the Europeans had to scratch around a bit to find things that people in India wanted to buy.
Interesting. I see there's a question on the chat from Diane, who asked, would the two different species of elephant actually interbreed?
Yes, that's a very good point. There is some interbreeding, but the gene flow it only goes one way. And it's temporarily escaped me which way it is, but there is some genetic contribution from one species to the other, but it doesn't seem to have happened on a scale, or at least it's limited enough that the species are still two separate species, according to the taxonomists.
Good. Let's open up to anybody who wants to ask a question. You can unmute yourself and ask. Just wait a minute. Let's see. Lilith wants to ask a question, so let's start there.
Judy, were there any survivors of the wreck? Any skeletons? Any idea what happened to the crew?
We don't know what happened to the crew, but it's probably not a very happy story. There were we don't know whether there were any survivors. There was one shoe that was recovered that had a bit of a had one foot bone in it. So clearly some people did go down with the ship. It's possible that some people got ashore alive, and they may have lived along that coast for some time afterwards. If they met up with local Khoi or San people, it's possible that they were able to live alongside indigenous groups, as we know that shipwreck survivors did along the Southeast African coast in later centuries, but we actually don't know. It is, of course, ironic that they were sailing to the east with this heavily laden ship. They were hoping to bring back trade goods that were going to make them rich, and they were wrecked on perhaps the richest diamond-bearing shore in the world, but they could derive no benefit from that.
Please ask your questions.
I have a question for Professor. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I believe that trace element analysis is used on rhino horns to elucidate the origins, because the trace element reflects the diet of the rhino. Is the same true of elephants or other species that you mentioned? And maybe you'd like to just comment on trace element analysis. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So for people in the audience who might not know this term trace element, so those are different chemical elements that occur at very low abundances in tissues. And the problem is with archaeological and shipwreck specimens is that there's a lot of contamination. So the analyses we were doing here were on proteins that we were able to extract relatively intact. In fact, we were able to extract intact protein from these tusks. And therefore we know that the DNA and the isotopes that we were measuring come from the protein that was in the tusks when the animal was alive. The trace elements tend to be much more generally much more randomly distributed through the ivory and subject to contamination from seawater. So we did look at strontium in the tusks, for instance. We had hoped that that might tell us something, but all we got was the strontium signal of seawater, because those tusks have been marinating in seawater for 500 years. So we don't think that trace elements are going to be helpful in this case.
Any other questions?
Professor, can I ask you whether we've done much study on the various elephants in South Africa? Because the elephants in Addo seem to be very much more relaxed and different to those we find in the bigger parks. And even the Knysna elephant, I think, must be different.
Yes, I'm not really the best person to answer that question in regard to elephant behavior and elephant sort of habits, but I know that people have studied that, and there is quite a lot of work going on their genetics, and we have done a lot of isotope work on elephants, looking at their use of the habitats, looking, for instance, at how much tree, how much bush and how much grass food they eat, and how that varies through the year. So one of the issues for park managers is the extent to which the elephants are eating and rooting up the trees, and thereby affecting the plant ecology of the parks. And doing the sort of isotope measurements that I've just described is one way to quantify how much of that vegetation they're actually consuming. And some of the people who've worked with our research group here at UCT have been doing that in conjunction with park managers.
Lilith will just say something quickly.
Our next month's speaker is Jane Marston, who has a lot to tell us about the looting of the Baghdad Museum, which should be fascinating. I can't remember when it is. Wednesday.
1st of September.
1st of September.
Good. So if there's no more questions, may I just use the opportunity, Judy, to thank you for what you've done here. I think it's important that we understand the past, what happened, where things came from, and it is fascinating how detective work can do this, how we can understand things that happened 500 years ago just from analyses and isotopes and things like that. Very interesting, very fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for what you've done for us this evening. There will be a small honorarium on its way to you if Lilith gives me the details of how to get there, but we'll talk about that later. Thanks very much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you, I think it's the 1st of September again, in the same fairly impersonal way. Thanks a lot.